Time to learn about James David Vance, Trump's vice president nominee. From the beginning, I need you to understand J.D. Vance isn't your run-of-the-mill far-right racist. He is part of a deep intellectual tradition that is called the Dark Enlightenment that's been rolling around on the far right for years and years in intellectual high society circles. It has become something that has electrified the tech industry with big proponents like Peter Thiel or Elon Musk himself, some of the richest men in the world, now bankrolling, again, the Trump campaign and thus the Trump-Vance campaign. J.D. Vance rose to ridiculous fame after writing the fan fiction book about his family hillbilly elegy, where he presented himself as a all shucks, part of the working class, when he is in fact an Ivy League educated venture capitalist. A 2020 movie out of his best-selling book also rose him to even greater fame. Not only that, J.D. Vance has a very powerful far-right billionaire backer, Peter Thiel, of the PayPal fame, and part of the political assortment known as the PayPal Mafia, including Elon Musk and a number of other figures we'll get into. Vance also won even more liberal fans as he presented himself initially as a never-Trumper, thus a moderate Republican, which gave him immense amount of time to be on television and talked about in a positive manner by liberals. In 2022, he rides his fame and billionaire backer money to feed longtime Democratic politician from the corporate wing of the Democratic Party, Tim Ryan. Thus, he enters the Senate as the new senator for Ohio. But a brief glance at his influences will see that he's anything but a moderate Republican, by citing some of the most reactionary figures of the moment, such as Joram Hazony, who's associated with the National Conservative Conference, which also J.D. Vance is associated with, a gathering of neo-fascists and neo-reactionaries from around the world. And most dangerously, Curtis Yarvin. You might not know who Curtis Yarvin is, but unfortunately you know several of the terms he has invented, such as red pilling. Curtis, along with British philosopher Nick Land, developed the Dark Enlightenment, or the neo-reactionary movement. It is sometimes also abbreviated as NRX. It's an anti-democratic, anti-egalitarian movement, and they seek to literally turn back the advances of the Age of Enlightenment. And what does this mean? They do not believe in democracy. They propose for monarchism, including absolute monarchism in the form of the Prussian monarchy, and an end to most of the liberties you and I take for granted. It has its roots in the work of Stephen Saylor, a eugenicist and far-right advocate. Nick Land is also known as the godfather of accelerationism, or rather we should say right-wing accelerationism. Accelerationism is the idea that if you provoke crisis, you can help accelerate the end of capitalism. Left-wing ideas is towards an anti-capitalist idea to develop either some utopian socialist or communist future. The right-wing version of this is to create fascism. Nick Lang also coined the idea of hyper-racism, where he discusses positively the idea of scientific racism and eugenics. In his idea of accelerationism, it includes explicitly racist views and has been recognized by many experts as the ideological background for the alt-right. Nick Land admits that he drew inspiration from Peter Thiel's libertarianism, or as he describes it in an article for New York Magazine in 2016, neo-reaction has a number of different strains, but perhaps the most important is a form of post-libertarian futurism that, realizing that libertarians aren't likely to win any elections, argues against democracy in favor of authoritarian forms of government. Most people in this philosophical view also include ideas around the technological singularity infused into their idea of right-wing accelerationism. Ways to achieve acceleration also includes assassination, murder, terrorist attacks, and the literal overthrowing of governments. In an article for the Sociological Review, Roger Burroughs describes the ideology's core tenets as anti-democratic, anti-egalitarianism, pro-eugenicist, racist, and most likely fascist, and ridicules the entire accelerationist framework as a faulty attempt at mainstreaming misogynist, racist, and fascistic discourses. And he criticizes them for their racial principles and their brazen disavowal of any discourses advocating for social economic equality, and accordingly considers it a eugenics philosophy, in favor of what Nick Land deemed as hyper-racism. The New American Right believes in a concept called the cathedral, where real political power lies within the United States and other countries. It is an amalgamation of the media, institutions of higher learning, people who basically influence politics and culture within society. And he sees them as a class, a social class of so-called Brahmin, drawing from Indian caste structure. Yarvin and the Dark Enlightenment are committed to the idea that the cathedral's assertion and pushing of socially progressive values to the masses actually erodes the social order, which is a very wild take considering all research that points to the opposite. Drawing on computer metaphors, as we have to remember Curtis Yarvin is a computer engineer, he thinks that society needs what is called a hard reset or a reboot, not a series of gradual political reforms. Thus, he is a revolutionary. He rejects gradualism and rejects democracy innately. Instead of activism, he advocates passivism and claims that by not engaging with the system, the progressivism that maintains the current status quo can actually collapse itself. And adherents should rather call for new architectures of exit from the current system rather than engaging with the system in political activism. So what would this society look like? Well, because in Yarvin's view, democratic governments are ineffective and wasteful, and they should all be replaced with sovereign joint stock corporations whose shareholders, large owners, elect an executive with total power, but must serve at their pleasure. The executive, unencumbered by liberal democratic procedures, could rule efficiently, much like a CEO monarch. Yeah. Yarvin points to Deng Xiaoping's China as a market-oriented authoritarianism and success stories like the city-state of Singapore as examples of successful authoritarianism. He sees the US as soft on crime and dominated by economic and democratic delusions. Publishing under his pseudonym Moldbug, he's come up with ideas like Hitler's invasions were in self-defense, that America has ruling communists, that political correctness was an elaborate mechanism for persecuting racists and fascists, and that if Americans want to change their government, they're going to have to get over their dictator phobia. He also has some profoundly racist views, like a pro-slavery position, and that some races are more suited to slavery than others. He also believes in the IQ superiority of white people. He also thinks that, and I quote, "It should be obvious that, although I'm not a white nationalist, I'm not exactly allergic to the stuff." And he also said about the US civil rights programs that were, I quote, "applied to populations with recent hunter-gatherer ancestry and no great reputation for sturdy moral fiber. Absolute human garbage." J.D. Vance, as a disciple of the Dark Enlightenment and neo-reactionary ideas, repeatedly states openly, constantly, and publicly the same ideas that are being put forward by Curtis. With J.D. Vance on the ticket, the Dark Enlightenment feels ready to throw money in, seeing Elon Musk committing to spend $45 million a month to get Trump elected. If you're curious, the max a regular person can donate to a candidate is $3,300. J.D. Vance is also incredibly anti-Ukraine and wishes for Russia to win and has been active in wanting to push the Russian position in the war consistently for over a year. Vance, like people within the Dark Enlightenment, see the US as a declining power. And he's been pushing the position that the US cannot afford to help Ukraine because it doesn't have the ability to create munitions, forgetting the fact that you can increase your state capacity to do these sort of things, and also that the assistance of money to Ukraine is such an insignificant amount of money versus the US economy. And if you're curious about what Vance thought about Trump just a couple of years ago, he said, "I go back and forth between thinking Trump is a cynical asshole who, like Nixon, wouldn't be that bad and might even prove useful, or that he's America's Hitler. How's that for discouraging?" But remember, his views against Trump is not because he isn't far right, he's just far right from a different intellectual tradition and think Trumpism is a vulgar version of his far right ideal. And that is the main difference. Now he's his big ally because he sees it's useful. And because we're almost out of time, let's go through Vance's greatest hits, such as women should stay in violent marriages for the sake of the children, that the US needs a denazification plan for purging liberals, or when he says stuff like, "We are in a late Republican period, evoking the common new right view of America as Rome awaiting its Caesar." I think Trump is going to run in 2024. I think what Trump should do is, if I was giving him one single piece of advice, fire every single mid-level bureaucrat, every civil servant in the administrative state, replace them with our people. When the courts stop you, stand before the country and say, quoting Andrew Jackson, "The Chief Justice has made his ruling, now let him enforce it." And keep in mind, we are just scratching the surface of the Dark Enlightenment, the neo-reactionary clique, and the New American Right. And if you don't think this will affect you because you're not in the US, think again, especially if you're in the UK, where Peter Mandelson helped Peter Thiel own your NHS health data. Thank you.